Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event today. My name is Karma Lowe, and I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Enrollment, and Community Engagement here at the Columbia School of Social Work. I come to you today from unceded Lenape land and want to again welcome you to today's talk on anti-Semitism and allyship. In a moment, Dean Melissa Begg will introduce our speaker, Rabbi Ron Fish, but first I want to note a few housekeeping items. Please feel free to utilize the chat box for comments, reactions, and resource sharing. We also encourage you to submit questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And these questions will be posed to Rabbi Fish during that portion of today's talk. Professor Amy Worman, one of our lecturers in discipline, will moderate the Q&A section. As we want to ensure we maximize our time with Rabbi Fish, I'll now pass the mic to Dean Begg for his introduction. Dean Begg?
Thank you, Karma. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As Karma said, I'm Melissa Begg, and I have the great honor of serving as Dean of the Columbia School of Social Work. The School of Social Work and the entire social work field are dedicated to maximizing well-being and ensuring that all can reach their full potential, no matter their life circumstances. We are currently celebrating our 125th anniversary as the first school of social work in the nation, and I'm so proud of the work my colleagues are doing, which continues the vital work we must continue to do to combat racism and oppression and promote diversity, equity, and justice. Sadly, racism, bigotry, and ethnic and religious bias represent enormous obstacles to achieving well-being. They continue to plague our society. Today's lecture, entitled Anti-Semitism Today and Yesterday, How Allies Can Work Together on a Better Future, is timely and all too relevant as we've seen a disturbing rise in anti-Semitic speech and violence across the country over the past few years. Now, this is the first in a series of events throughout this calendar year focused on Jewish identity and the challenge of anti-Semitism. The goal is to ensure that these topics are addressed in a thoughtful and meaningful way. And I'll say this, one of the things that gives me the most hope about humanity is our capacity for growth and our ability to apply what we learn in ways that support all of our communities, including how to work together to be better allies, which our esteemed guest speaker will touch upon today in his lecture. And on that note, it is my great pleasure to introduce Rabbi Ron Fish. Rabbi Fish currently serves as the Northeast Division Director of Anti-Semitism Education and Advocacy for the Anti Defamation League, serving 6 New England states plus New York and New Jersey. His central role is in addressing anti-Semitism on college campuses and to offer support for Jewish communities during those first years of adolescent independence. His work is directed toward helping directors of diversity, equity, and inclusion, provosts, and university presidents to understand the experience of Jewish students on campus and their unique and diverse needs. Prior to joining ADL, Rabbi Fish was a congregational rabbi in Connecticut and Massachusetts for 25 years. Most recently, he served as the senior rabbi for Temple Israel in Sharon, Massachusetts. Rabbi Fish is a member of the executive committee of the Massachusetts Board of Rabbis and has led multiple interfaith clergy associations. Rabbi Fish, pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dean Begg, and thank you to everyone who made this event possible. I'm very grateful to Amy Worman, who began the process of kicking this off and making sure that we could achieve this really important opportunity to talk together. I'm also grateful to Karma Lowe and to the others in the organization, and of course, Lorenzo, Shane Graham for helping to make everything come together as well. I'm going to begin with events going on down the street, just a couple dozen blocks south of Columbia. And I don't know if any of you with your busy schedules get the chance to go to Broadway, but those of us certainly who don't live in the New York area are somewhat jealous of Broadway just down the street. A parade is the dramatic retelling of events from Atlanta in 1913. There's Ben Platt, and you will be aware if you're familiar with the show that it has actually garnered some controversy in the course of the opening days of the program, of the performance. ADL, the organization for which I work, was founded in the wake of the events that are described in the play. In 1913, the Jewish American community was heavily a community defined by recent refugee status and immigrant status. Jews had come in huge numbers from Eastern Europe in the previous 30 years to these shores, seeking an opportunity to make a living and also be free of the violent pogroms, which were essentially state-sponsored terrorism against Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. Leo Frank, who was a Brooklyn Jew, was among those who came from those origins. He found a job as the manager of a pencil factory in Atlanta. And while he was there in 1913, a young woman, she was not a young woman, she was a girl, but in 1913, she passed as a young woman, Mary Fagan, who worked in the factory, was found raped and murdered. In the course of the investigation, although there were others who were suspected of the crime, there was a hue and cry in the community. It made national news. It was a cause célèbre across the nation. And the call was for the Jew to be responsible, to be held responsible for this horrific crime. Leo Frank was convicted. Subsequently, the governor commuted his sentence from death to prison for the fact that the evidence was so weak against him. In fact, much of the evidence seems to have been created by the rage that was existing across the community against him. And ultimately, Leo Frank was lynched by an enraged mob, and he was murdered. Of course, the story of lynchings against Americans in the United States is a story where African Americans are overwhelmingly the victims of these horrific crimes. But in this case, a Jewish person was targeted for a crime he did not commit, and he was targeted with death at the hands of vigilantes who claimed to be acting on behalf of justice. The story was so grievous, was so shocking, that the American Jewish community looked at itself and wondered whether we were about to engage the same kinds of trends that had been seen in Europe. And the Jewish community organized around the notion that we needed to do something different in America from what we had seen previously. Here we had rights, and here we would organize to defend against the defamation of the Jewish people and to work for just and fair treatment to all. That dual mission goes back to this story, and the Jewish community that began this work in 1913, 1915, and the subsequent years was a community that had very little means, very little access to power, deeply felt themselves to be, as in Europe, a community that was targeted for rage and violence. And still they were willing to step forward and say, we're going to live by the American ideals, even if they are so imperfectly realized. I think the American Jewish community in a certain way has that in common with other communities, with advocates for African-American rights, for LGBTQ rights, women's rights, and others. And our partnership, ADL's partnership over these decades, is a partnership which is founded on the idea that one vulnerable community is a community which suggests vulnerability for everyone. The reason for this rage against the Jewish community in Atlanta in 1913, the reason there was such willingness to have screams, chants in the street, hang the Jew, can't be understood without looking back to history. And I think it's important for us to take a moment to go back through the historical record of the anti-Semitic traditions which undergird America, which undergird the West, and have in fact for 2,000 years. The story of rage against a Jew in Atlanta can't be understood unless we understand that those motifs, those traditions which saw Jews as other, as potentially demonic, were integral to much of the Western world. And this, of course, it's important for us to remember, this is not a discussion at this point about the Holocaust. When we're talking about anti-Semitism in 1913, we're by definition talking about decades before the rise of Hitler, before the final solution, and before the death camps. And still these motifs were on full display. Sometimes when we talk about anti-Semitism, we kind of are drawn, almost a gravitational field. We're drawn to the power of the memory of the Holocaust. We're drawn to events far away in other places, in other times. But perhaps the Leo Frank story will allow us, if we can, to get past that gravitational field and to see anti-Semitism for what it is. It is a distorting view of the Jewish community and of Jews as individuals. It's a distorting view of Jewish institutions, which has a long history without the Holocaust. And it is a history which continues to be a challenge in the ways we see Jews addressed today. So I want to first bring you to where I believe it's important to begin. Some of the ancient roots of anti-Semitism can be found. In the earliest decades of the Christian church, there was an ongoing debate about how to see the Jews. Were the Jews, as some people suggested, an important link to a divine covenantal past, which was necessary to understand the Christian story, or were the Jews something else entirely, something to be seen as a danger? I'm sharing with you now one of the most horrific quotes from that period, from an early church father, John Chrysostom of Constantinople. In his work against the Jews, he could not be more explicit. He says, the Jews sacrifice their children to Satan. They are worse than wild beasts. The synagogue is a brothel, a den of scoundrels. He ends by saying, I hate the Jews because they violate the law. I hate the synagogue because it hates the law and the prophets. It is the duty of all Christians to hate the Jews. Often when I give this reference in my teaching, I make a point of suggesting that nobody who carries a Christian identity, who believes in Christian faith, should see this as an attack against their tradition or their beliefs. People of all kinds, of all backgrounds, can look back in their sacred traditions and find things for which, in my language and traditional religious language, for which they need to repent and reflect. But it doesn't define the fullness of Christian faith to read this text. It doesn't define the fullness of anyone's religious tradition to read their most dangerous and difficult resources and texts. At the same time, it is important to see that in this story, in this early decades and centuries of the emergence of Christianity from within Judaism, there was a trend, at least one of the major trends, which saw in Jews not just a distinct group from which they emerged, not just a group who believed wrongly in their faith view, but it was a community that was at its core in league with Satan. It was a community which was dangerous because of its beliefs, and it was a community which had to be resisted. Probably his words were written actually in reference to the fact that there were Jews all over, of course, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, the ancient world, and those Jewish communities were often living side by side with their early Christian communities, and it was really important to this early Christian church to make a distinction, to stop people from thinking they could be both Jews and Christians. It was important to them to draw a very, very stark line. And so this language, this dehumanizing language, became a vein within early Christian thought. As an antidote, perhaps, to that thought, emerged Augustine of Hippo. Augustine, who wasn't exactly, I would say, pro-Semitic in the way he articulated his theology, he did argue against this overwhelming condemnation of Jews as needing not just opprobrium, but eviction from society and, in essence, murder. Augustine says it's important that the Jews remain because they are a link to that ancient past, and they show the veracity of Christian faith in his view by their link to antiquity. Augustine said famously, "Slay them not, but scatter them in your might, lest your people forget your law." Augustine's claim is not that Jews are worthy in their own right. It's not that Jews are a beautiful tradition which goes back to antiquity, which has integrity even alongside Christianity. He still was a believer in the supersessionist view that Christianity needed to push aside Judaism, but his view was that Jews should not be oppressed too much, and they should be allowed to live. Small consolation from the perspective of the Jewish people, but consolation nonetheless, because his view became, in essence, the dominant view of the Catholic Church for much of the following 1,000 years. Jews might be endangered, might be limited in their political or economic rights, but Jews would be permitted to survive. That view was held sway theologically, perhaps, and intellectually, but on the ground, many communities did not find themselves embracing this idea. During the Crusades in the 11th century and 12th century, there are many stories of local militia leaders, crusaders, of local Christian leaders who were distinct from the bishops or others who were connected to Rome, that the local leaders were taking the opportunity of this invasion from Europe to the Middle East to stop along the way and murder Jews as they encountered them. The stories are bone-chilling and horrific of mass murder of Jews along the route, and this becomes the backdrop for much of Middle European Jewish memory about the relationship between Jews and Christians. It is unfortunate bishops like the Bishop of Trier did try to protect the Jews of his community, but ultimately he gave up. He gave them the option of protection if they converted or not if they did not. And he said he simply could not withhold the rage of the mob against this Jewish community. He said, "You cannot be saved. Your God does not wish to save you now, as he did in earlier years." The tragedy of the Crusades haunts Jewish memory in Europe. The poetry that Jews who survived wrote about those events are poetries which persisted in Jewish prayer books in many communities up until the modern era. They are stories which echo through the years. And while Jews had made their homes in Europe at this point for nearly 1,000 years, sometimes preceding the communities that identify as the nations where these communities lived. Jews were in Spain before Spanish was spoken. Jews were in certain German lands before German was spoken, in Hungary before Hungarian. And so the Jews thought of themselves as at home in these lands. And yet the Crusades came to remind them that they were, in fact, in exile. The expulsions of the Jewish communities of Europe were not just the famous expulsion from Spain in 1492, but Jews were expelled historically from England in 1290, from different parts of France over the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, and of course, very famously from Spain and Portugal, 1492 and 1497-98. These expulsions were in many places a back and forth discourse between seeing Jews as a part of the community, a necessary component of a society that required understanding and tolerating diversity, and then at times there would be religious zeal that would see them otherwise. In Spain, where the Jews had been living since perhaps the time of the Second Temple, so more than 2,000 years ago, the Jews of Spain had lived during a significant period of cultural openness. They had lived partially under Christian and then under Muslim rule in Spain as more than even a tolerated minority community, but a celebrated minority community from time to time. Starting in the 14th century and then continuing through the 15th, the concern that the Jews were a dangerous internal foreign group became so intense that essentially the state orchestrated mass interrogations of Jewish communities, lest they be a source for Christians finding their way to Judaism. The oppression of the Jews in Spain was a shock after so many years of living side by side. The motifs about Jewish power and Jewish wealth in particular were resonant throughout much of Europe. And this is strange when one considers that Jews were very often of the same economic status as their neighbors. And in many cases, of course, where oppression reigned, they were particularly poor and without financial resources. So why were Jews perceived as wealthy? Well, one reason has to do with a law in the Bible. It exists in the Jewish text as well, which prohibits money lending on interest. Jews were not alone in this. Christians and Muslims also had rules against lending to one another on interest. That was understood to be, from an ancient point of view at the time of the Bible, a kind of a law which commanded charity. If your neighbor needed seed to plant before the coming season, if you gave it to him and charged him at an exorbitant rate, or even at any interest, it was seen as if you were not helping him survive, but you were really trying to live off of his suffering. And so you were required to give him the full sack of seed so that he might survive, have enough to eat, have enough to plant for the following season, and to move forward. Already 2,000 years ago, Jews saw this law as unworkable in a world of mercantilism, essentially, or in a world of proto-capitalism even, where people were lending to each other really as business partners. The Jews permitted this version of lending on interest, but Christians took it quite seriously in the Middle Ages and said that they could not lend to one another on interest. However, Jews were compelled in many cases to engage in money lending. This was considered a field where Jews in particular could act as quasi-foreigners and in their lending money help grease the wheels of the economic system that needed capital to grow. However, during difficult times, during times of drought or times of other kinds of economic hardship, when Jews were required to collect the monies that were owed them, the local communities saw Jews very often as driven by money, as stealing from their local Christian communities, and were seen, in fact, as a kind of a demonic force that was entirely wrapped up with the power of mammon, the power of money. Of course, Shakespeare's famous play, Shylock, presents this in dramatic form. And we recall in Jewish experience that this play in particular doesn't only embody Shakespeare's classic power with language and his facility with creating meaningful characters. What we see in this is the caricature of a Jew who's willing to take a pound of flesh is his claim when someone owes him money. In the end, perhaps most readers missed in antiquity or in the Middle Ages, missed the nuance where Shylock is given some human characteristics as well. That was Shakespeare's gift when he says, hath not a Jew eyes, does not a Jew bleed when you cut him? Those humanizing aspects were overlooked in many cases by those who held up this model of who a Jew is in Europe. Money hungry, willing to take from the flesh of his neighbors and without any compassion. The danger here is, of course, that these motifs, these tropes about Jews did not end in antiquity, did not end in the Middle Ages. Instead, they got transformed and they got new form in the modern era. As nationalism grew in Europe, the Jews were seen as foreign as well, as diminishing the power of local communities, as diminishing the capacity of local communities to pursue their own goods and their own interests. And Jews were therefore seen as a dangerous third, what's the term? It's a dangerous force that would undermine the society in which they lived. Obviously, the most dramatic, the most graphic example of this view of the Jew as foreign and as dangerous existed in Nazi Germany. But in truth, those views existed everywhere throughout Europe, when Hungary, when Poland, when France, and even England were facing challenges in the 20th century. Many communities saw Jews as a foreign and dangerous community who might undermine the state. Nazism, as you know, in Germany resulted in the most horrific mass murder of Jews of anyone because of their identity in history. However, Nazism was appealing even in places that one would not imagine they could be. It was appealing in Poland, even as Poland was afraid of the invasion of Germany. It was appealing in France, even as the French were afraid of the coming Nazi armies. And it was in 1939 appealing in Madison Square Garden in New York City, where famously there was a massive, massive rally to support Nazi Germany and to blame the Jews for all of the troubles, for the depression, for economic suffering that existed in the United States. How is it possible that America, on the eve of World War II, could be a place where such comfort was found with these anti-Semitic tropes? How is it possible, whether it's 1939 in Madison Square Garden or 1913 in Atlanta, Georgia, how is it possible that America was a place where such anti-Jewish hate could express itself? Well, the answer is really that these hatreds against Jews have remained through history back to great antiquity, even as they change and transform over time in order that they might be applicable in different circumstances. When we look back at the strains of history, going back all the way to the earliest iterations of anti-Jewish hate 2,000 years ago, when we see those iterations and we follow those veins of hate through from the past to the present, what we see is that the unique role of Jews in the Western imagination is that there is a community here that we're talking about that remains in league with demonic forces, that looks at the world in ways that only have to do with taking and benefiting, not serving one another, that this Jewish community is itself at core a force that must be either tamed, transformed, evicted, or murdered. There is no question that the unique role of Jews in the Western imagination is one that requires staring honestly into the past and into the present and telling the truth. We have not yet defeated these monsters in our past. We have not yet defeated this horrific hate. And it's important to say that anti-Semitism, like other forms of racism, anti-Semitism is the responsibility not of Jews to fight. It's the responsibility of everyone to fight. It is the responsibility of all communities to tell the truth about where we come from, to identify the ways in which our society has allowed hate to define itself over time, and to do the work together of righting those wrongs and to fight against exactly the expressions that we've seen most recently. I have up on the screen here now a picture from the Charlottesville rally in 2017, where these white supremacists chanted bizarrely, incomprehensibly, unless you know the history, "Jews will not replace us." What did they mean, Jews will not replace us? Well, they were drawing upon all of these motifs, and they were articulating in a contemporary American form, a 21st century form, what that ancient hatred looks like. So this great replacement theory, which not only resulted in the mass murder of Jews in Pittsburgh in 18, but also resulted in the mass murder of Black Americans in Buffalo in 2022. This view of a society that is rightfully white and Christian, that is being overcome, is being thoughtfully, conspiratorially, planfully invaded by people of lesser worth, people of brown or Black backgrounds. Those people are being manipulated by actors like George Soros, Jews who happen to exist as supporters for refugees, supporters for liberal causes around the world. And those forces are trying to destroy America, trying to destroy Europe, European culture, trying to destroy the West. And everything necessary to stop those evil forces must be done. This kind of overarching white supremacist ideology continues to find expression in America, in New Zealand, in Norway, where all these shootings have taken place. And it takes place sometimes where Jews are the direct victims of this hate and violence, as in Pittsburgh. And sometimes it takes place where others in El Paso, in Buffalo, are the direct violent victims. But in almost every case, there is a conspiratorial understanding of the role of the Jew in the world, which stands behind this unspeakable violence. There is an enormous challenge that exists on every campus and across America today in talking about Israel. Israel is a real place with real and very divisive politics, with real challenges. People who speak out against Israeli policies will have lots and lots of friends in the Jewish world and even in Israel, where, as you may know, hundreds of thousands are on the streets right now protesting. Hundreds of thousands take issue with all kinds of policies that Israel is engaged in. That is fair game. In the modern period, as Zionism emerged as a Jewish response to the challenges of modernity, Jews bought into the idea that we want to be part of politics. We're not willing to be powerless anymore. And so Zionism, the belief that the Jewish people have a right, like other peoples do, to their national purpose, their national identity, that we have a right to a homeland and to a place that we can call our own. That idea, rooted in the ancient connection to the land of Israel, an ancient connection, by the way, which was never broken, and in which hundreds of thousands, millions of Jews from North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond were also prayerfully and positively connected over time. That idea that Zionism is a core belief of Jewish identity in the modern world is widespread in the Jewish world, and it is among the most successful ideas in the history of ideas. It's among the most successful ideas, for sure, in all of Jewish experience. Doesn't mean, as I said, that it's not a contested and difficult idea, but it is an idea which is at the core of much of modern Jewish identity. So challenging Israeli policies is for sure different from anti-Semitism. But going to the core, claiming Zionism is engaged in genocide, a Holocaust, comparing Israel to the Nazis, that is an entirely different thing. The Jewish story of identity and connection with the land of Israel and the Jewish dream of a return has been an eternal component of Jewish belief and practice. The Jews, whatever our diversity and identity, the Jews as a whole are a community that has roots in the Middle East, has a history throughout all of the ages in the land of Israel and in environs. And the return to Israel cannot be described as simply criminal, genocidal, colonialist, an external force to supplant locals, because it is completely ahistorical. And the attempt to do so, which we see so commonly today, is one of the most difficult challenges we face. Because people who might be very, very well-meaning would suggest that they're only working for the human rights and national rights of others, of the Palestinians. And Jews, many, many Jews, believe in the human rights and the national rights of Palestinians alongside Israel. In fact, I am confident, although different polls will tell you different things, I am confident that the overwhelming majority of world Jewry, of American Jewry, of Israeli Jewry would like to see two states for two peoples. It has been very difficult because of the recurring rejection of the right to Israel to exist. And the voices that call Israel a Nazi regime, the voices that call Zionism inherently foreign, are not just ahistorical, they are invoking classic anti-Semitic tropes, which go all the way back in our history as well. It is a very big challenge to create the space on campuses for everyone to have their say, for everyone to give voice to their understanding of events in a complex world, and to make sure that when we do that, we don't dehumanize anyone. It is the job of universities to look carefully at the structures that exist, at the codes of conduct that exist, to make sure that their codes of conduct encourage robust, challenging free speech, but also do so while protecting the human dignity of everyone. When a Jewish student, when a Jewish individual, when a Jewish professor is challenged that they are somehow personally responsible for every misdeed, real or imagined, of the Jewish state, there are a number of motifs that we are familiar with through history which come back to us. Motifs that somehow Jews are conspiratorially organized across the world and across time to undermine others' human rights, that Jews are responsible way beyond anything that makes any sense for the suffering of all people in the world. Just recently, I'm sitting in the Boston area. Just recently, there was what's called the Boston Mapping Project. It was an attempt to make a conspiratorial map with literal Jewish institutions and Jewish individuals on this map for explaining all of the suffering in the world. Palestinians, which perhaps is a little less surprising, and also in some measure, all anti-Black police violence in America was traced back to this Jewish nexus. Such overarching conspiratorial explanations for all that is wrong in the world are anti-Semitism, and they are clearly identifiable based upon our memory and our history. In preparing for today, I had an opportunity to look at the National Association of Social Workers' primary mission, the statement of purpose. The primary mission of the social work profession is to enhance human well-being and help meet the basic human needs of all people, with particular attention to the needs and empowerment of people who are vulnerable, oppressed, and living in poverty. I think it's incredibly moving to read these words. There is no question that the mission of social workers, and as those of you who are being educated to become social workers, this mission is a core mission for all good people. It's a mission which I entirely endorse. I would ask that the social work school and all universities think about how every community fits into this definition. One of the challenges in addressing the needs of people to enhance their human well-being is whether we're using an outsider's lens to understand what those people want, or whether we're willing in humility to listen to individuals and communities for them to explain what it is they think they need to thrive. It is my strong belief that one of the challenges we face in America today in addressing the question of anti-Semitism is that people tend to approach the question of who are the Jews with a set of lenses that define the equation, the situation, before we encounter a single individual. Jews in America are by and large identified as white, identified as people of privilege, and identified as people who are not endangered and have no reasonable reason to express concern about their well-being. There are reasons for those points of view. I will say that I think overwhelmingly the Jewish American experience has been an extraordinarily positive one. Jews have done remarkably well in this country. Jews have done well on university campuses, and Jews have done well thanks to the opportunities that American liberty and democracy have provided. Sometimes Jews who were perceived as white, in fact, were able to go quickly from being refugees with very little to being the parents of doctors and lawyers and the people who felt very much at home in this country. And there's been a blessing that the Jewish community is aware of on American shores. But that's not the only story. Jews carry with us other stories as well. Stories of exclusion, including, by the way, on the campus of Columbia University, where at one time in the 1920s, it was a concern, was Columbia becoming too Jewish? And so they made a separate campus for Jews in Brooklyn for a period of time. There's a story of exclusion from higher learning, a story of exclusion from certain professions and certain economic opportunities. And America has as well welcomed in Jews who have very, very recently in other parts of the world experienced real imminent danger. Jewish communities from the former Soviet Union came here in the 1970s and again in the 1990s, fleeing massive oppression. Jews fled from Persia, from Iran, in the 1980s and sought refuge here in order to become fully Americans and to be part of another society where they might be welcomed. These stories are not stories from antiquity. They're not stories from the 19-teens. We're talking about stories from 30, 40 years ago. And Jews as well will report about their own experience, that their vulnerability includes the knowledge that Israel's many wars of survival have included elements of the concern that another Holocaust could unfold on those shores if Israel is not secure enough. And so when rockets fall on Sderot in southern Israel from Gaza, while there is massive suffering in Gaza that concerns us, the Jewish community and some of us with relatives living under that constant missile fire, the Jewish community sees a genuine vulnerability is not manufactured, it is not concocted, it is real. And our relatives, and sometimes we ourselves, are dying as a result of those encounters with violence. So when social workers ask the question, how can we help a Jewish community that has a history of exclusion, that has a history of feeling vulnerable, that has a recent and contemporary experience of being endangered? It's important first to hear what the Jewish community is saying, and to hear that the Jewish students and Jewish faculty who are saying that their connection to Israel is urgently a part of their identity, to hear that these Jewish students and faculty who are saying that their lived experience of exclusion and vulnerability is not manufactured, it is real, to hear that their experience of being called dismissively white and privileged is erroneous on so many fronts. The Jewish community, by the way, is about 15% today people who identify as Jews of color. And in Israel, about 60% of Jews come from the Middle East and North Africa. Jews come in all economic backgrounds, from all places along the socioeconomic line. And actually today, the largest growing component of the Jewish community in New York, the ultra-Orthodox community, is among the poorest communities in New York. And so when there are, in many cases, legitimate news articles about the failures of that community, there's a concern as well, whether we are blaming the victim, communities that are themselves deeply, deeply vulnerable. I want to share with you a number of resources. Among them, is this resource called Antisemitism Uncovered. That may or may not open correctly. Yep, it is opening correctly. Antisemitism Uncovered is a fabulous resource from the ADL. It's a series of very short videos that try to connect the dots between these ancient tropes of anti-Semitism and their more contemporary expressions. That Jews are seen as powerful beyond what's appropriate, seen as disloyal. Those tropes, which have roots in great antiquity, continue to express themselves in modern contexts and in ways which are very, very dangerous. The other resources I want to share with you are the ADL Campus Anti-Semitism Survey of 2021, which shows that 43% of students on campus today have indicated that they've either been the target of or they have witnessed anti-Semitic acts on campus. They also report that they have, in 75% of the cases, not reported and don't even know perhaps how to report about anti-Semitism. One of the things we ask for every educational institution is to do their best to convey to all students that they should report all forms of bias, and certainly they should report acts of harassment based upon a person's ethnic or religious or racial identity. And ADL is a partner in collecting all of that data. In fact, we have just released our audit of anti-Semitic incidents from 2022, and the numbers are shockingly stark. There was a 36% national rise of the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the country in 2022. That 36% increase is the highest number we've ever seen. There were 3,697 incidents, and we do a very specific job tracking each anti-Semitic incident across the country to make sure that we're not talking about something which perhaps doesn't qualify as an anti-Semitic incident. And these incidents have been measured since 1979. This is the highest number in that 43-year period. What's even more shocking is that for the last 5 years, have had all-time high numbers in that count. There is no question that leadership matters. And when President Trump praised the folks in Charlottesville and said there are good people on both sides, that opened the door. When we see things like what we saw in Washington on January 6th and the anti-Semitic slogans that some of the perpetrators were wearing and chanting and carrying, we see that there is something that has been unleashed. We also see when there is a regular demonization of Israel in language that goes far beyond anything that is legitimate criticism. When we hear that demonization happening on a regular basis, we also know that that plays a role in increasing anti-Semitic views. We tracked, for example, in 2021, during the conflict between Israel and Gaza, that there were, during that period, a spike in anti-Semitic attacks, including against Jews who were wearing recognizable Jewish clothing or attending a Jewish event or going to a Jewish restaurant. Those things that took place were tied to the war in Gaza, but had nothing to do with criticizing Israel. What it was this event, this series of conflicts between Israel and Gaza, Israel and Hamas, have also, in the language of leadership, unleashed rage against the Jewish community, which is very, very dangerous. The 111 acts of physical violence we counted in 2022 were overwhelmingly, disproportionately so, pointed at Jews who identify and wear clothing that identifies them as Jewish from an external point of view. Many of those attacks were on the Orthodox community in New York and in Brooklyn, and many of those Jews feel very vulnerable for good reason after assault after assault after assault that has taken place. We recently released the Views of Anti-Semitism in America survey, and we are concerned to share that these surveys, which have been done periodically over time, mark the relative popularity of anti-Semitic views in America. And currently, we have seen a significant rise. people who hold 6 of the major anti-Semitic views, which are tracked in this survey. Those folks have gone from about 10% of the American population to about 20% of the American population just in the last 3 years. So that survey is well worth taking a close look at to see how those views persist. Finally, I want to share with you 2 really important tools. One is Think, Plan, Act. This is a tool intended for Jewish students, for Jewish institutions to learn about what we see when we see anti-Semitism on campus and how we can respond. And Think, Plan, Act is wonderful because it also gives folks resources. And one of the most important resources is building alliances to make sure that anti-AAPI hate is not left for the Asian American community to fight alone, that anti-Black hate is not left for the Black community to fight alone, and anti-Jewish hate is not left for the Jewish community to fight alone. Think, Plan, Act is a wonderful resource for those students. We also provide a program called Hate Uncycled, which is available to schools, to institutions to bring, which teaches about bias in general and how we can uncycle these cycles of hate. We act in the end, and I will end here before questions, in the end, for all of the concerns that I've shared with you today, for all of the deep, deep concerns that exist within the Jewish community and within many communities in America today, there is an enormous resource. It's right at our fingertips. It's each other. There has to be a growing sense of relationship and responsibility to hear each other, to take seriously each individual's and each community's self-reporting about how they live in the world, and to work to build relationships where people can act as allies to one another so no one is alone. I hope and pray that this time of year, where Jewish students might be thinking about the coming of Passover next week, and Muslim students are observing Ramadan, and our Christian friends are observing Easter, this is the time for us to look across the divides and to see not difference alone, but to respect that difference in the embrace of our common humanity. That is where the force against hate can most effectively yield results that we all need. It's an exhausting world right now. There's too much hate out there. There's too much violence. There's too many of our students who live in fear. On behalf of the Jewish community's concerns, we only ask that you listen with an open heart to our concerns and do what you can to build a community that is responsive to those needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Fish. Now I'd like to ask Amy Worman to come on camera to facilitate our Q&A session.
First, I want to thank you, Rabbi Fish, for an amazing presentation. I don't understand how you included all of this in 1 hour, but it's impressive. You went through the history of anti-Semitism, the current manifestations of it, the scope of the problem, and the fact that you ended with hope is so heartwarming. So thank you so much. I want to call everyone's attention to some resources that have been posted through our chat. Just to name a few, there's a podcast called Gate Crashers and something else called Bend the Arc. So please populate chat with any resources that you have, everyone. Really helpful. I just wanted to explain quickly how sort of this initiative at Columbia, the School of Social Work, has come to be. So one way that it has begun is through me personally, where when I do student orientations, I identify myself as Jewish. And I have found that after I introduce myself to new students, I will get a lot of emails with students who are concerned about identifying as Jewish. They are Jewish, but their parents have said, don't mention that when you're at school. Nothing good can happen. You need to hide it. You know, you're opening up a can of worms. And I have found this really, really disturbing. Also in classrooms, there have been a sort of incidents where, like you spoke about, Rabbi Fish, there are Jewish students who speak up about their Jewish identity, and they've been dismissed because of their proximity to whiteness. Okay, and you have so wisely said that racism is in this country is about color, but that's not always the situation around the world. And certainly as Jews, we know that racism is not necessarily about color. I began looking into best practices, sort of. What is the proper way to combat anti-Semitism? Like, do we just give a bunch of panels? Do we talk about it in one class? And so in this journey that I've been on, I saw that the ADL has a whole department for doing research on interventions for anti-Semitism. And I have been very fortunate to have the support of an amazing administration, Dean Begg, Karma, Nicole, Lorenzo. We have a great team here, and we're really going to be doing something that we hope is going to be the model for other schools of social work. So I just wanted everyone to sort of know how this came to be and why I sit here right now. Okay, so let's get to our questions. So I'm going to start with a question where by Samantha Freed, and it has a sense of urgency to it, so I want to make sure we get to it. She says, let's see, where did that go, Samantha?
Yes, I see it here.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I see it.
So
she asked why are students and others who care about social justice are inclined to educate themselves and do deep introspection, except when it comes to Jews.
Right.
Very, very, very good question. Did you want to add to the question, Amy?
No, I think she had presented that very well, and just if you would like to respond to it, yeah.
Yeah. So let me say this. And I did scan through some of the questions as you were talking just now, and those are some of the most challenging and core issues I think we're addressing here. The story of the Jewish community in America, as I mentioned, as I think as a whole, we can't, and no one would even suggest otherwise. It has been a great story in the 2,000 years of Jewish exilic experience. The Jewish experience the Jewish experience in exile has never been as good as it is here. And so in a certain sense, our focus today is talking about how this is not a resolved problem. And that is true, and it is a growing problem. Even so, we need to be telling both stories simultaneously, that America gives us the capacity to fight these problems, even as the problems persist. One of the dangers that we face in general when we're talking about complex issues in society is the fixation on one fact to the exclusion of others. More than one thing can be true at a time. And so the central story of racism in this country is absolutely the stories of indigenous people experiencing genocide, and the story of Africans brought here as slaves, and the story of their descendants being treated without any humanity and with enormous indignity over centuries. That story is the most pervasive, real story of racism in this country. Those stories, which are not the stories just of groups, but of individuals who have lived that oppression. And it is critical that that we all tell the truth about that experience. It's why it's so dangerous that the teaching of history right now seems to be under assault in certain quarters of what people call the political right. The truth is, one can be a political conservative and believe fervently in the need to tell the truth about our history. How else are you going to grow? That may be the most urgent part of our American system, which is that we should not shut ourselves off from truth, that political truth should guide the way we evolve as a nation. But even given that reality, the Jewish story is much more complex than mostly what we tell. I think I'll be ungenerous to Jon Stewart, who I really enjoy, as everybody does. But there's a kind of a Jon Stewart, maybe you would call it a Woody Allen from a certain generation, a version of the American Jewish experience, which seeks to diminish genuine Jewish suffering as something that's only, the word is kvetchy in Yiddish, only a kind of a whining, only a kind of a self-absorbedness that is not worthy, that Jews don't really have much to complain about. And we should see the Jewish complaint about American experience only in negative terms, that there's something wrong with the Jewish community to lift up its experience in any way. There's actually an intersectional insight here. I'm not an expert on intersectionality, but there's an intersectional insight here that that comes from the fields that have studied how intersections of suffering and of oppression often produce their own follow-on oppressions when people who work for liberation in one context are told their other concerns don't matter. You know, classically, the example is of African-American women who in the struggle for civil rights were told to, in some cases, keep their concerns about feminism quiet, and in the struggle for feminist rights were told to not emphasize too much the concerns of civil rights. I'm not an expert in that field, but there's something resonant there from the Jewish experience. I think that there are many Jews who have been told again and again to diminish their own lived experience of recent refugees status, of exposure to violence or exclusion, that they've been told that those don't really matter because the larger, truer story is the story of Black America, for example. And I think part of the job we're trying to do right now is to say the Jewish story is worthy. It's worthy of being told, and it's worthy of being heard. And that story is the story which is, in America, complex with both negative and positive aspects. And it's really important to say that not all Jews are white. Not all Jews, in fact, have the Jon Stewart or Woody Allen experience and lineage. That many, many Jews have had a different experience. And we're living in a time actually of a flowering of the awareness of the diversity of the Jewish community. In so many ways, Jews today are rediscovering their multi-ethnic, multicultural identities, and the Jewish role in that complexity and that mosaic is core as well. So, for example, many of us have discovered that our experience in recent memory includes Jews who come from what would have been considered non-Ashkenazi parts of the world, that our experience includes, in my family, Italian Jewish experience, in my wife's family, Romanian, which actually is almost Turkish Jewish experience. It's actually right next door to Turkey, if you look at the map. And that the Jewish experience in Israel of the last 75 years is a story of the rediscovery of the complexity of Jewish identity for Jews too, And all of our experiences are worthy of being told and being understood. So I would just say, perhaps the answer to this question, very simply put, is that the Jewish story in America is often dismissed because Jews have been dismissing it. And we need all to do a better job taking seriously the ways in which suffering, exclusion, oppression, harassment and silencing continue to be a problem even in this beautiful country.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi Fish. So here's a question. How would you advise faculty to support Jews of color who face intersecting racism and anti-Semitism?
I think the first priority is to listen to people's lived experience and to take it seriously. There is so much that goes back to that question of simply hearing what Jews, be they Jews of color or be they Jews who present as white, what their experience is and what it means to them. And so I think the first thing to do is to listen and to take that seriously. And next, there is an internal conversation in the Jewish community to deal with anti-Black racism in the established institutions of American Judaism. There is no question there is work to be done to do that better. And supporting those students, maybe supporting them as they discover and expand their own authentic Jewish voice, and to see what one can do to help support those Jewish institutions as well. Another truth is that we at ADL do a lot of this work as well. We are engaged on a regular basis with a range of cross-community partnerships and relationships, and we are being led by a number of wonderful Jews of color in this work who continue to help us see the ways in which the community can do better and the way we can serve everybody's needs. I'll leave it there for now and see if I can come back to some of my thoughts there in a different way.
Okay. Can you explain how anti-Semitism is not rooted in religion, but based on Jews being an ethnic racial group?
So this is an important question, a historical question of really a first order. The Jewish experience in America suffers from, and this will overlap, I think, to the previous couple of questions, suffers from the problem that goes to the lenses that the American community uses to understand who Jews are. America essentially has become aware, except among the quarters that deny all problems, America's become aware of the problems around race, around religion, and around gender and sexual identity. Those have become the lenses that Americans hopefully put on to understand the issues that are present in our country today and how those various communities have been excluded over time, not just recently. The Jewish community challenges those lenses. We challenge those lenses because, as Amy said a little while ago, the Jewish community is a diverse community racially, in terms of skin color, in terms of ethnic identities that trace around the world. And so in a certain way, to call Jews something other than white, if the Jew in question presents as white, is inaccurate. It doesn't work in America. But when Whoopi Goldberg, who I love, when Whoopi Goldberg said the Nazis and Jews wasn't a story of racism, it was two groups of white people, it was just the story of man's inhumanity to man. When she said that, she essentially wiped away Jewish experience. She wiped away the reality of the Jewish encounter with this unique form of hate. And so it's important to be aware of the lenses we put on. Jews are not quite defined as a religious community because there's a tremendous variety of ways Jews express their religious identity, and because there are Jews who don't observe at all, and for whom Jewish identity is still very central to who they are. Jews are not quite an ethnic community, period, because our ethnicity is actually, as I said, diverse itself. It stretches across different national and ethnic boundaries. In the classic American parlance, we're racially not one thing. And so we're not quite just an ethnic group either. We're something more particular. The Jews tend to be, I think, accurately understood as an ethno-religious group that looks different depending on the broader context in which we live. If a community is heavily defined by religion, Jews will be defined by religion. If Jews live in a community where other markers are used to define people, then that's something that will pop up. The Jews will be seen in that way. But I think one of the things that is important for social workers in particular is to learn the tool of using the lenses that are given to you by the people who are talking to you. Use the lenses, the frames that they provide to understand who they are. And in the Jewish community's case, it is fair to say we see ourselves, by and large, as a community that is joined together across lines of religious difference, across lines of ethnic and perhaps racial difference. We are bound together as kind of an extended family that has a common history and common destiny. That idea maybe goes back to the core of the biblical story, right? Before the Torah was given, before the revelation at Sinai, we were already a people. We were a people that came into being with a common ancestor with Abraham and Sarah. And we are a people to this day that have a theological claim or a peoplehood claim on identity that precedes religious thought. That doesn't quite fit exactly neatly into the lenses that we generally use in America, but that's okay. We can all live with different lenses.
What are the origins of African-American anti-Semitism?
So this is a really thorny problem because obviously these two communities that are largely seen as separate, in fact, overlap in certain ways. And it's also a thorny question because of the clear role of anti-Black racism in America, which defines so much of the core sin of American history. There are multiple layers to the story of anti-Black racism, anti-Black racism in the Jewish community and anti-Jewish anti-Semitism in the Black community. I will just acknowledge a few things. One is that the Jewish experience overwhelmingly is a story that begins in huge numbers in the 1880s. In 1881, there began to be huge numbers of Jews that moved from the Russian Empire and all of Eastern Europe to America. Those Jews pretty much had no interaction with people from Africa prior to their moving to America, and their experience as people generally with white skin was an experience of trying very hard to make it in America, and an America that was extremely racist, and to make it by presenting as American, that is to say, as white as they could. That challenge did produce tensions between the two communities. Black communities often did feel in the early part of the 20th century that the Jewish community was insufficiently concerned about their social rights, their civil rights were not sufficiently of a high priority to the Jewish community. The Jewish community recalls correctly, I would say maybe in greater numbers than we might suggest in some other contexts. But the Jewish community recalls that Jews played a huge role in the development of the NAACP. The Jews were very active in civil rights groups. The Jews died alongside African Americans in working for civil rights during the Freedom Riders period in the South. That Jews were core to the constituency that was trying to lift up everyone. And the movement toward a freer, better America always had Jews at the front lines as well. Yet, the Jewish community was really focused on its own needs and its own interests because there was such a focus on survival among this community of new immigrants. And so I think the tension in some ways goes back to two kind of deeply interwoven communities that had so much in common, so much about their experience that required fighting the common enemy of white supremacy. And so those two communities saw each other with, I think, some degree of suspicion. I'm going to fast forward here to say in the last 60 years, some of the tension is over the identity in some parts of the African-American political community with what used to be called the non-aligned movement, with the third world, with the developing world, and the role of Palestine in that third world, developing world advocacy, that Israel was seen, I think, in distorting terms as simply a colonial white supremacist enterprise to supplant a local indigenous brown community. That idea has had purchase in parts of the Black community, and it is a tragedy, in my view, because it is so mistaken on so many fronts. The Jewish community continues to dream about two states for two peoples. The suffering of everyone in the midst of that conflict is of grave, grave concern. And whatever mistakes are made on the Palestinian side or the Israeli side doesn't diminish the humanity of Palestinians and Jews as a community. But some of the rhetoric, including some of the BDS, the boycott, sanctions, and divestment movement rhetoric that exists, is lifted up as an example of fighting against apartheid in a modern form. There's resonance in the fight against Israel and the fight against South Africa, which is a continuation of this distortion. And the tension in the Jewish-Black relationship today is one in which greater understanding requires an openness to hearing one another. Jews simply, as a rule, do not see any relationship between the existence of a Jewish state as an expression of their rights, like other nations' rights, as comparable to what existed in South Africa in any way, shape, or form. And the Jewish community continues to be deeply insulted that the idea of colonialism is what is applied to Jews returning to their ancestral homes, to the Jews returning to some degree of sovereignty in the world. It is complex because the Jewish community, Israel, has not always been perfect in that conflict. And there are plenty of stories of suffering all around in which one can simply play the game of some community being responsible for all that is wrong in that part of the world. It would be, I hope, everybody's honest goal to hear the truth of the stories of massacres and expulsions and inhumanity on both sides, so that we can work toward greater peace and understanding and the opportunity to live side by side. The Jewish and Black communities today, I think, are actually closer together perhaps than they have been in some time. I think there's something really profound about this chance that Jews will not replace us, murders in Pittsburgh and Buffalo, kind of echoing in all of our ears as a form of shared vulnerability. And unfortunately, often it does take a sense of shared vulnerability for communities to see difference and to perceive the common threat we all face.
So I'm going to hand it over to Karma in 1 minute, but I just wanted to thank you, Rabbi Fish, so much for this. And I don't think it is coincidence, I guess, that we're having this presentation a week before Passover, which is the festival of freedom and the liberation of all peoples. So thank you so much. And I'll
absolutely
hand it over to Karma.
To finish on a note, I think that's exactly right. The story of Passover is the story of remembering the bitter. We eat bitter herbs. Remembering the suffering of persecution, we eat unleavened bread, which we call the bread of affliction, and to lean into that story so that we might taste of the 4 cups of wine, which are the flavor of liberation. And we don't just hopefully leave the doors closed. We open the door for Elijah. And when we do that, we sing about a redemption that goes beyond the story of Passover, but a redemption for the whole world. A redemption where nobody is left out in the cold and where everybody's dignity is respected.
Thank you, Rabbi. And thank you everyone who was able to attend today. I also want to join others in thanking the amazing team of folks who helped bring this event to fruition. As Dean Begg said, this is the first of a series of events that will be happening throughout the calendar year. So please know that this was not a one-off. I also want to thank the participants who were so engaged in the chat box, for sharing your resources, for taking the time out of your day to learn about anti-Semitism, and for being open to learning more about anti-Semitism and allyship. We will be compiling the resources that were shared by Rabbi Fish, as well as those that were shared by participants in the chat box, and we'll be sending those out via email and also posting them online. For anyone who has additional resources, including you, Rabbi Fish, please feel free to send them to us at the DEI email address at swdei@columbia.edu. And again, Rabbi Fish, a huge thank you for providing us with such good information, such context, such intersectionality, such perspectives. You are so appreciated.
I'm just going through the comments here and seeing all this wonderful discourse about West African and East African Jewish communities. Fabulous stuff. Thanks to everybody for sharing that in the chat as well.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
All the best, everybody.